Many theories are spent on the origin of man. Some can trace our name to the family tree. But for me, I'm content with the blessed Bible plan. And you can't make a monkey out of me.
The 1925 Scopes monkey trial was a groundbreaking legal case in the battle between evolution and creationism. Reflecting a growing division between modernists and fundamentalists, the trial centered on whether evolution should be taught in public schools, and contained an underlying debate over who should control the curriculum. Due to the presence of celebrity attorneys William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, the press coverage brought the controversial issue onto the national stage and turned it into a monumental clash of fundamentally different viewpoints. While appearing to simply be science against religion, the core of the conflict was a battle between Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian philosophies over how much regulatory power the federal government should hold. The Scopes trial was a turning point encompassing religion, law, and education that indirectly led to the decline of the anti-evolution movement, the change in interpretation of the constitutionality of anti-evolution statutes, and the increased federal regulation of public school curriculums. In America, the 1920s were a time of change and social unrest. Before 1920, concerns about school curriculums were scarce, as the number of public school students was small. However, the increased attendance of public schools between 1890 and 1920 created the largest student population in American history, many of whom were being taught evolution in their science classes. At the same time, World War I and the American Industrial Revolution were coming to an end. As historian Edward J. Larson writes,
"The inhumanity associated with such events discredited the evolutionary idea of progress, while the general social dislocation that they caused drove many people to seek stability in traditional religious beliefs rooted in creationist concepts."
These people became the core of the fundamentalist movement. On March 21, 1925, Tennessee Governor Austin Peay signed into law the Butler Act, a statute prohibiting the teaching of human evolution in public schools. Immediately, the American Civil Liberties Union placed an ad in the Chattanooga Times for a client to test its legality. This caught the eye of George Rapelier of Dayton, Tennessee, who devised a plan to use the case to benefit Dayton's economy. Rapelier found his perfect subject in John Scopes, a substitute teacher and football coach who agreed to participate. While a regular churchgoer, Scopes strongly disagreed with the Butler Act. On May 7th, Scopes was arrested for teaching evolution in the Ray County High School. William Jennings Bryan, a three-time presidential nominee and fundamentalist leader, joined the prosecution team to continue his crusade against evolution and cap off his political career. The defense gained their own titan, as criminal lawyer Clarence Darrow signed on to rival Bryan and upset the anti-evolution movement. The goal of the defense was to present the case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, which required the Dayton jury to return a guilty verdict. The defense intended to use the trial to argue against the constitutionality of the Butler Act and stop the anti-evolution movement from spreading. After 7 days of debate, the jury convicted Scopes and the judge set the fine at $100. The defense appealed the decision to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the ruling was overturned on a technicality in 1927, as the jury should have set the fine. The Butler Act had been upheld, and the Tennessee Supreme Court had prevented the defense from appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. The trial had as much of an effect on the public perception of Tennessee as it did on the public perception of the anti-evolution movement. 5 days after the trial, Bryan died in his sleep, becoming a martyr for the anti-evolution crusade. From 1925 to 1928, the movement experienced a rise in popularity and momentum because of the increased sensitivity towards evolution after the trial. During this time, 2 more anti-evolution bills were passed in Arkansas and Mississippi. The scramble for anti-evolution legislation was a response to Darrow and the ACLU's involvement in the case, as many fundamentalists felt that their beliefs were being threatened. Locally, many fundamentalist and anti-evolutionist organizations appeared, and evolution-related content in high school biology textbooks decreased dramatically. Without Bryan as a unifying force, however, the anti-evolution movement had trouble continuing. With organizations springing up everywhere in America, the movement was internally unstable and lacked unity. Bryan had been the face of their struggle, and the anti-evolutionists no longer had a gifted orator to articulate their ideas or a strong leader to fall back on. As financial issues and a loss of support continued to weaken the movement, the 1929 stock market crash bankrupted the ailing crusade. However, scientific institutions were not as harmed during the downturn, and by the beginning of the 1930s, the damage done to the pro-evolution forces had been reversed. Public opinion towards the fundamentalists and anti-evolutionists became largely negative, and evolution slowly worked its way back into science textbooks. One of the most significant changes brought about by the Scopes trial occurred in 1968, when the United States Supreme Court faced the case of Epperson versus Arkansas. Susan Epperson was a biology teacher at Little Rock Central High School, where the school system had recently adopted an evolution-inclusive textbook. The still-standing 1928 anti-evolution law, however, prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. Placed in a legal dilemma, Epperson looked to the courts to find the statute unconstitutional. The United States Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional because it used vague language and favored the establishment of one religious sect. Justice Abe Fortas delivered the decision, saying,
"The vigilant protection of constitutional freedoms is nowhere more vital than in the community of American schools."
The difference between the decision of the United States Supreme Court in 1968 and the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1927 is the recognition of religious preference in anti-evolution laws. The Butler Act was justified because, according to Justice Alexander Chambliss, it requires nothing to be taught. This mindset was abandoned in the 1968 decision, as the U.S. Supreme Court redefined the meaning of the First Amendment and applied its restrictions to the states. With regard to the power of Arkansas, the Supreme Court stated, "It is much too late to argue that the state may impose upon the teachers in its schools any conditions that it chooses, however restrictive they may be of constitutional guarantees." The opinion delivered by the Supreme Court in 1968 represented a complete shift in interpretation of the First Amendment and anti-evolution laws, as well as a triumph for those who desired more strict control over public school curriculums. In a broader context, the Scopes trial represented a clash between Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian philosophies, which addressed the amount of power governments should hold. In Dayton, the conflict manifested itself as the debate over who should control the school curriculum, the educated minority or the majority. In Tennessee, the state was overwhelmingly against teaching evolution, and many in Dayton felt that the defense team was forcing secular beliefs onto citizens. For these people, the teachings of the Bible represented a way of life, and scientific theories could not compete with the traditional reliance on the Bible. Jefferson believed that the core of democracy was the farmer, and Bryan's traditional ideas paralleled those of Jefferson. Fundamentalists rejected the new ideas presented at the Scopes trial because their traditional beliefs were incompatible with modern theories. Conversely, Hamilton had warned that majoritarian rule would lead to tyranny of the majority, and believed the government should hold more power than the people. Hamilton also valued the participation of the educated elite in government and held learned citizens in high regard. Similar to Hamilton, Darrow valued intellectualism and believed it fought off bigotry. In the end, the Hamiltonian view triumphed as the Scopes trial helped solidify the power of the federal government. The states had to rely on the opinions of intellectuals regarding decisions about education to allow educational standards to be established. Science standards were strengthened with the publishing of the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study textbooks in 1960, which were written by professional biologists and filled with information on evolution. With regard to public education, the logical values behind science had trumped the emotional and faith-based values that had supported the anti-evolution movement. The Scopes trial was a significant turning point in history because it created long-term ripple effects that still influence society today. In 2005, the controversy resurfaced in Dover, Pennsylvania, as a contest between evolution and intelligent design, a theory crediting a superior force with the design of the natural world. The decision in Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District labeled intelligent design as a religious theory attempting to circumvent the decision in Epperson v. Arkansas. The case was a failure of anti-evolutionists to regain ground lost after the Epperson decision. There is no doubt that the theory of evolution's place in public schools will continue to be tested in the future, yet the judicial interpretations, public opinions, and legislative decisions that began with the Scopes trial have pushed the struggle largely in favor of evolution. not only because of its scientific validity, but also because of the religious tolerance and intellectual authority it represents.